The checkpoint stood at the edge of a narrow country road, where wooden barricades and an iron swing gate marked the final crossing before Allied-controlled territory. And by dusk, the line of civilians stretched back past sandbag posts and temporary watchtowers as evacuation clearance closed with the curfew bell, scheduled to ring within minutes. Guards moved with increasing urgency, calling out final names from a clipboard, while a military clerk compared identification papers beneath a hanging lantern whose light flickered in the evening wind. She stepped forward when her turn came, presenting folded documents stamped months earlier during winter registration. But the clerk paused at a small notation near the corner that read "Hold for review" in faint ink. He asked her to wait aside while others were processed. And as more names were cleared, the gap between her and the moving line widened. A guard at the outer barricade began ushering remaining civilians inside the perimeter, repeating that once the curfew bell rang, the gate would close without exception. She approached the clerk again, explaining that her transit clearance had been approved at the district office 2 days prior. Yet the clerk insisted that any file marked for review required secondary confirmation from regional command. Behind her, the iron gate creaked as it began to swing inward, signaling the final boarding window was ending. The crowd thinned rapidly as the last families hurried through with bundles pressed against their chests, and she found herself standing just outside the narrowing opening, with only 2 guards between her and the interior yard. The curfew bell sounded from the watchtower, low and deliberate, and the guard at the hinge post placed his hand on the gate bar preparing to secure it. She did not shout or attempt to force passage. Instead, she remained still, holding her documents against her coat, as if steadiness might delay the inevitable closure. At that moment, the American officer responsible for checkpoint supervision stepped from the inspection tent after reviewing a separate convoy ledger and saw the final motion of the gate, aligning with the quiet figure outside it. He asked why processing had halted, and the clerk replied that her file contained a review mark connected to occupation-era warehouse records, and that clearance could not be granted without secondary authorization. The officer glanced once at the shrinking gap between the gate posts and then at the fading light beyond the road, calculating not only regulation, but risk of leaving a civilian outside the secured perimeter overnight. As the gate moved toward its final position, he reached forward and placed his gloved hand firmly against the iron bar, stopping its movement before the latch engaged. The metal vibrated under the pressure of halted momentum. He ordered the guard to hold the gate open until the file could be examined directly, rather than deferred until morning, stating that procedural review did not require abandonment beyond curfew. The guards froze, uncertain but compliant under his authority, and the iron gate remained suspended between closure and entry as the decision shifted from automatic exclusion to deliberate examination. Inside the inspection tent, the lantern light cast sharp shadows across wooden tables, covered with ledgers, carbon copies, and stamped transit slips, and the officer placed her documents flat against the surface, while the clerk retrieved the occupation review binder from a locked trunk positioned beneath the desk. Outside, the partially open gate remained guarded, but unsecured, a visible reminder that time and authority were now intertwined. The clerk pointed to the faint notation beside her registration number, explaining that during the final months of occupation, she had been assigned to a supply warehouse located near the grain storage depot, and that post-liberation screening protocols required review of any civilian linked to logistical infrastructure previously used by enemy administration. But she responded calmly that the assignment had been mandatory under ration control orders, and that refusal would have resulted in detention. But the clerk countered that proximity alone triggered temporary holds regardless of individual explanation. The officer asked whether any formal accusation accompanied the mark or whether the hold existed solely because of employment location, and the clerk admitted that no charge or witness statement was attached. Only the warehouse proximity code transferred automatically from municipal registry when evacuation lists were compiled. The officer then examined the transit authorization stamped at the district office 2 days earlier and questioned why the hold notation had not been resolved before clearance issuance. The clerk suggested that district offices often processed documents in bulk and deferred sensitive cross-references to border checkpoints for final confirmation. The tent remained quiet, except for the scratch of pen against paper, as the officer copied her registration number into his personal notebook for cross-checking against a secondary file stored in the communications crate. He asked her to describe her warehouse duties precisely, and she explained that she had logged inventory crates of flour and preserved vegetables during winter allocation cycles, without access to distribution orders or transport manifests. The clerk maintained that occupation warehouses had been used for supply redirection benefiting enemy units, and that civilian staff sometimes cooperated willingly to secure personal advantage. Yet, she did not raise her voice in defense. Instead, she reiterated that the work had involved counting and recording, not decision-making authority. The officer requested the ledger of inventory anomalies, compiled after liberation, and compared the dates listed there with the months she had been assigned to the warehouse. Several entries indicated unexplained shortfalls in stock that had later been traced to redistribution towards civilian districts rather than military kitchens, a pattern not immediately consistent with collaboration. The clerk hesitated at this correlation, acknowledging that some discrepancies had puzzled review teams, but had not been attributed definitively to sabotage or error. The officer closed the binder slowly and stated that a hold based solely on employment location without documented misconduct warranted direct assessment rather than overnight exclusion beyond secured lines. And he instructed the clerk to keep the gate open until the anomaly log could be fully reviewed. Outside the tent, the guards maintained position at the iron bar, and the checkpoint, which had nearly closed by routine procedure, now paused under deliberate scrutiny as documentation, rather than assumption, began to determine whether she would pass through before night sealed the road. The officer requested the occupation-era warehouse registry from the communications crate, and as the clerk unfolded the brittle pages, marked with ration allocation tables and delivery routes, the quiet tension inside the tent shifted from gate procedure to historical scrutiny. Her name appeared beside weekly inventory columns during the harsh winter months, when fuel shortages had forced civilians into long bread lines, and the ledger indicated that she had been assigned to reconcile incoming grain sacks with outgoing distribution tallies. The clerk pointed out that several weeks showed irregular quantity adjustments that required explanation, suggesting that unexplained reductions in warehouse stock during occupation often implied diversion, and diversion during that period could carry opposing interpretations depending on intent. She described the winter conditions, limited heating, strict curfews, and guards who counted sacks before and after every transport. Her responsibility, she stated, had been limited to copying numbers from delivery manifests onto allocation boards posted for local ration supervisors. The officer asked whether she had ever altered figures independently or received instruction from occupying authorities to reassign food toward military kitchens, and she replied that the warehouse supervisor, appointed by Occupation Command, had issued distribution lists that prioritized certain districts over others without public reasoning. The clerk interjected that those priority shifts coincided with unexplained reductions recorded in the anomaly log, now resting on the officer's table. The officer cross-referenced the dates and noted that during weeks when certain civilian districts reported unexpected ration arrivals, the warehouse register simultaneously reflected small shortfalls, not attributed to spoilage or transport damage. He asked her directly whether she had adjusted the figures herself. She answered that her task had been to transcribe incoming numbers, but that in several instances she had recorded arrival quantities exactly as delivered, even when instructed verbally, to post reduced amounts on the public allocation board. The distinction, though subtle, implied that official warehouse counts remained accurate, while posted distributions for occupying forces reflected smaller totals than anticipated. The clerk hesitated, Realizing that if arrival logs were recorded faithfully, while posted board totals were lowered, surplus stock might have been redirected quietly towards civilian kitchens rather than occupying garrisons. The officer leaned back slightly, considering the implications. If she had resisted inflated requisitions by preserving accurate counts in central logs while allowing public allocation boards to suggest reduced stock, the warehouse supervisor's directives could have been undermined without overt defiance. She clarified that she had not altered transport routes, nor opened crates, but that recording truthful arrival quantities prevented supervisors from justifying additional requisition demands, and in several cases the preserved surplus had been distributed by local ration heads to districts facing starvation. The tent remained silent except for distant wind against canvas, and the officer closed the registry carefully, recognizing that proximity to occupation logistics did not automatically signify cooperation. Rather, it might have provided opportunity for restrained interference, carried out within the limits of counting and transcription. Outside, the gate still stood held open under guard, suspended between assumption and recognition, while inside the tent, the narrative of her warehouse employment began to shift from suspicion of advantage to possibility of quiet correction, embedded within routine duty. The officer reopened the anomaly ledger and placed it beside the warehouse registry, so the dates aligned under the lantern's steady light. And as he traced columns with his finger, the pattern became clearer. During weeks when occupation requisition orders demanded increased grain extraction from civilian districts, the central warehouse totals remained unchanged, while the posted distribution sheets reflected reduced outgoing stock, a discrepancy that had once been flagged as clerical inconsistency, but never resolved conclusively. He asked her to explain the mechanics of how inventory boards were displayed and whether adjustments could be made without drawing suspicion from the warehouse supervisor. She described the layout of the counting room, where two boards existed, one internal ledger for shipment reconciliation and one public allocation board for ration supervisors. The internal ledger, she said, required signature confirmation, and therefore she recorded arrivals exactly as delivered. But the public board, which dictated how much grain would be removed the next morning, was updated under verbal instruction before guards arrived to escort district representatives. On several occasions when requisition orders demanded additional sacks for military kitchens, she wrote the reduced outgoing number on the public board, but preserved the true arrival figures in the internal ledger, creating a surplus that ration supervisors later discovered when reconciling discrepancies. The officer realized that such divergence would force warehouse supervisors to justify missing grain if they attempted to claim it formally, discouraging further overreach without exposing her to immediate accusation. The clerk, who earlier had insisted on procedural caution, now examined the columns with narrowed eyes, recognizing that the so-called irregularities had corresponded with documented relief spikes in certain neighborhoods suffering fuel shortages. She added that she had never taken food herself, nor directed redistribution. She had only ensured that the official arrival records could not be inflated downward to rationalize excessive requisitions. In doing so, she had created room within the system for local ration heads to protect civilian supply without triggering immediate audit alarms from occupying officers. Though the officer requested confirmation from the communications crate, and an aide produced a summary sheet compiled after liberation, noting that winter ration districts in her sector had experienced fewer starvation incidents than adjacent regions despite identical requisition quotas. The correlation did not prove intention beyond doubt, yet it reframed the interpretation of her proximity to the warehouse. Rather than facilitating extraction, she may have limited it through meticulous adherence to truthful counts. The tent air felt less accusatory now, and the officer closed the binder with measured finality. He stated that while formal verification from higher command would still be required, the evidence suggested that the hold notation attached to her file was based on surface association rather than comprehensive review. Outside, The iron gate remained suspended between closure and entry, but the weight behind it had shifted. What once seemed grounds for exclusion now appeared as concealed effort embedded within routine paperwork. The clerk adjusted the ledger margin where "Hold for review" had been written and left space beside it for amendment pending command approval, signaling that documentation was no longer merely delaying passage, but actively reconsidering it under fuller understanding. Before the officer could issue final clearance instructions, a field runner arrived breathless at the checkpoint gate, carrying a message from the Southern Road Patrol reporting that a refugee convoy had been diverted unexpectedly due to a destroyed bridge 2 kilometers east, and that the redirected wagons were now approaching the checkpoint from an unmonitored farm track not covered by the primary escort unit. The sudden development shifted the atmosphere from documentation to urgent coordination, as the officer stepped outside the tent to assess the situation, while guards adjusted positions along the sandbag wall. The runner explained that the convoy included elderly civilians and children who had been forced to abandon their original route at dusk and would reach the checkpoint after curfew without proper sector alignment. "You're risking confusion with unverified transit groups." The officer faced a choice: close the gate according to curfew protocol and risk leaving the convoy exposed in open fields overnight, or reopen escort lines and stretch already thin personnel beyond planned deployment limits. The clerk reminded him that regional orders emphasized strict gate closure to prevent infiltration attempts under cover of civilian movement, and that any deviation would require written justification. She stepped forward quietly and stated that during occupation supply shifts, she had used a parallel farm road connecting the grain warehouse district to the checkpoint through orchards and irrigation ditches, a route less visible but structurally stable and passable for wagons, even after heavy rain. The officer asked whether the path avoided the destroyed bridge sector entirely, and she confirmed that it rejoined the main road within sight of the checkpoint perimeter without crossing the damaged span. The runner verified that the convoy was currently stalled near the collapsed bridge awaiting direction, and time was narrowing as darkness deepened beyond the watchtower lamps. After brief calculation, the officer ordered a small escort detail to accompany him along the orchard track, while instructing the clerk to keep the gate partially secured, but not latched, pending convoy arrival. The decision balanced caution with necessity, neither full closure nor reckless openness. She joined the escort at the officer's request to guide them through the farm path whose entrance lay concealed behind a hedgerow broken during winter fuel collection. The road was uneven, but intact, bordered by irrigation trenches that reflected faint starlight, and the escort moved quickly to reach the stalled wagons before confusion escalated into panic. When they arrived, the convoy's lead driver reported fear of proceeding in darkness without confirmation of safe passage. She directed them onto the orchard route, explaining which turns avoided soft ground and which ditches must be crossed at shallow angles. The officer maintained perimeter watch as the wagons advanced slowly under lantern glow, ensuring that no unauthorized movement shadowed the convoy. Within 30 minutes, the first wagon reappeared at the checkpoint perimeter from the farm approach, exactly as she had described, validating her guidance under pressure. The crisis resolved not through dramatic confrontation, but through rapid adaptation, and as the final wagon crossed inside the guarded boundary before curfew fully settled, the officer recognized that documentation alone had nearly determined her exclusion, moments before her knowledge became essential to safeguarding dozens of displaced civilians. Once the last wagon crossed the checkpoint boundary and the gate was secured in controlled position, rather than sealed in automatic closure, the officer shifted from escort command to structured intake coordination, aware that the convoy's sudden arrival would strain registration capacity and food allocation already calculated for the evening. Lanterns were repositioned along the inner yard, and guards directed wagons into a staggered formation to prevent congestion near the inspection tent. She moved beside the intake table without hesitation, aligning displaced families into orderly rows and ensuring that elderly passengers were seated near the supply crate before documentation began. The clerk, who earlier had insisted on strict procedural hold, now observed how efficiently she translated field urgency into structured flow. Calling out household counts, confirming ration slips, and guiding children to remain with their guardians during identity verification. The officer requested that she assist in reconciling convoy headcounts against the patrol message delivered earlier, and together they cross-checked the runner's estimate with the wagon manifests to prevent duplication or omission. Though no single moment carried visible drama, the coordination required precision. If even a few names were misplaced in the ledger, the confusion could revive suspicion about unchecked entries at a sensitive border zone. As additional guards rotated from perimeter watch to support intake, she explained to the clerk how orchard track timing required staggered departure at dawn to avoid wheel congestion at the narrow bend beyond the irrigation trench. Offering logistical detail without presumption, the officer listened and incorporated her suggestions into the temporary departure plan posted beside the tent entrance. Meanwhile, rumors from the stalled bridge sector reached the checkpoint indicating that additional refugees might attempt to approach through alternative paths overnight, prompting the officer to deploy a small patrol to monitor secondary access points without overextending resources. She proposed using lantern placement patterns to signal authorized approach directions for any late arrivals, preventing confusion with unauthorized movement. The officer approved the measure and instructed guards to position lamps accordingly, reducing the risk of misinterpretation in low light. Throughout the process, her presence did not command attention. Rather, it anchored procedures that might otherwise fragment under sudden pressure. The clerk updated her file margin, replacing the ambiguous "hold for review" with a temporary annotation indicating active coordination assistance pending final command clearance. The change, though administrative, reflected a shift from passive subject of scrutiny to active contributor within the checkpoint structure. As the final wagon passengers settled into assigned spaces and food distribution commenced under supervision, the officer stood briefly beside her to confirm that the intake ledger balanced with convoy numbers and orchard reroute timing. He acknowledged that her familiarity with local terrain and supply flow had prevented both exposure beyond the gate and internal disorder once the convoy arrived. The war beyond the checkpoint remained unpredictable, but within its guarded boundary, shared responsibility had replaced procedural hesitation, and the evening that began with a nearly closed gate now concluded with structured cooperation sustained through mutual calculation rather than dramatic declaration. Shortly after midnight, a regional transport commander arrived at the checkpoint in a staff vehicle bearing sealed review documents from district headquarters, responding to the officer's earlier request for clarification regarding the warehouse proximity code attached to her file. The arrival introduced a new layer of authority that required the day's events to be examined under formal scrutiny rather than field discretion. The commander established a temporary review table inside the inspection tent and requested all relevant materials: the warehouse registry copies, the anomaly ledger, the updated intake log from the refugee convoy, and the margin note documenting her orchard route guidance. The clerk arranged the papers carefully while guards resumed perimeter positions beyond the canvas walls. She stood beside the table without embellishment, answering each question directly and without appeal. The commander examined the winter inventory columns and compared them with district ration distribution reports compiled after liberation, noting that sectors aligned with her warehouse assignment had experienced fewer starvation casualties despite identical requisition quotas imposed by occupation authorities. He asked whether any witness testimony existed, suggesting active collaboration, and the clerk confirmed that none had been recorded beyond generalized suspicion tied to employment location. The commander then reviewed the checkpoint intake ledger from earlier that evening, observing that her coordination had prevented manifest discrepancies during the sudden arrival of the diverted convoy. He questioned the officer regarding the decision to hold the gate open past curfew protocol, and the officer explained that documentation review indicated administrative ambiguity rather than substantiated misconduct, and that abandoning a civilian outside the secured perimeter would have contradicted both safety and procedural fairness. The commander listened without interruption before closing the warehouse binder and addressing the hold notation directly. He stated that transitional review systems often relied on automated proximity markers to flag potential risk, yet such markers required contextual verification before exclusion measures were justified. Based on the cross-referenced inventory anomalies, district ration outcomes, and the documented assistance rendered during the convoy crisis, he determined that the hold classification lacked sufficient basis to restrict transit clearance. He signed a formal amendment beneath the prior notation and stamped her file with "Cleared, no adverse record," instructing the clerk to update checkpoint logs accordingly. The sound of the seal pressing into paper carried institutional weight that replaced earlier uncertainty. The commander further recommended temporary appointment as civilian coordination assistant within the checkpoint system until permanent relocation could be arranged, citing her demonstrated logistical competence under pressure. The officer acknowledged the directive, and the clerk amended the ledger entry to reflect her new status. Outside, the night remained quiet save for distant wagon wheels settling into stillness. Yet inside the tent, the formal review concluded what the halted gate had begun: a transition from suspicion, grounded in proximity, to recognition grounded in verified action. By early morning, the checkpoint had resumed its measured rhythm beneath pale light, spreading across the fields, and the iron gate that had nearly sealed her out now stood secured in structured rotation rather than rigid exclusion. New intake boards were mounted beside the tent with updated departure schedules, reflecting the diverted convoy's arrival, and her name appeared not under pending review, but within the coordination column, assigned to assist with refugee processing and route verification. She began the day by reconciling lantern placement logs from the orchard route, with patrol reports to ensure that any late arrivals would approach through designated paths rather than unmonitored ground. The clerk, now operating without suspicion in his posture, provided her with duplicate intake sheets so she could cross-check wagon groupings against family counts before transport onward to district shelters. The officer conducted perimeter inspection and later reviewed the revised gate protocol that balanced curfew compliance with discretionary review authority, noting in his report that procedural rigidity without contextual assessment risked preventable harm. Throughout the morning, displaced families passed through the checkpoint yard under orderly supervision, and she guided them toward appropriate registration tables, while confirming that no manifest entry duplicated or omitted individuals from the previous night's convoy. Her familiarity with supply movement allowed her to anticipate bottlenecks before they formed, now redirecting foot traffic around crate stacks and advising guards on staggered release timing to prevent congestion near the gate hinge. The officer observed that her logistical precision had stabilized operations in a sector where transitional governance remained fragile, and he incorporated her recommendations into the checkpoint's revised intake manual, pending regional approval. Though no formal announcement marked the shift, the transformation was evident in the ledgers themselves. Her file now bore a clearance stamp rather than a caution code, and margin annotations referenced coordinated assistance rather than deferred review. The war continued beyond the boundary road. Convoys moved across uncertain terrain, and orders would eventually reassign both officer and assistant to different sectors. Yet the checkpoint that once nearly excluded her now functioned with integrated procedure, shaped partly by her measured judgment. Near midday, the officer paused briefly beside the gate to inspect its hinges, and for a moment the memory of the halted closure lingered, not as spectacle, but as decision made under fading light. She completed the intake ledger for the morning convoy and secured it within the trunk before preparing for the next scheduled transfer. Neither spoke of the tension that had defined the previous evening. Instead, Their coordination continued in quiet acknowledgement that documentation, once clarified, could correct assumption without noise. The gate opened and closed in steady intervals as the day advanced, and within its controlled motion lay a practical resolution. Dignity restored, not through applause or proclamation, but through structured inclusion carried forward into the routine of border duty, while the broader war moved beyond the checkpoint's guarded line.